Hey everybody, this is Tyler Brinks. Welcome to my webinar, Post-Spawn Bass Tricks. And we're going to talk about some of the things that I do during this time of year. A lot of people don't like the post-spawn. It is a little tricky, but there are some tricks to help you catch more fish. This webinar will be recorded, so you can catch it later on YouTube. I'll also put it on, it'll be on the Navionics website as well. So there's a few options if you want to go back and check something out, or if you miss any of it. You'll be able to look at it at a later time. The other thing is you can answer questions or ask questions at any time. So feel free to just shoot those off. There's a Q&A section. It should be right on your screen. Just feel free to ask any questions. We'll answer them as we go. And then at the end, we'll also answer any questions that we missed. And just a little bit about myself. My name is Tyler Brinks. I'm from Spokane, Washington. I'm an outdoor writer, tournament angler. I do a lot of stuff with different brands in the industry, and I fish a lot. So this is some of my tricks that I use this time of year, to catch more bass during the post-spawn period. We're gonna go ahead and get started with a quick poll, and then we'll jump into actually going over all the good stuff. Okay, just about everybody has answered their questions. I'll go ahead and share the results real quick, just to give you an idea. And this is kind of good for me to be able to see when the bass spawn in your area. Some people say January and February, so you're probably down in Florida, Texas, places like that. March, pretty popular, but it looks like, April, May is the most common. So right now, is the post-spawn period. And, there's always stragglers spawning a little bit later. So, definitely the post-spawn period can be, a full month. It could be, immediately after the spawn. There's a lot of segments. There's actually pieces within that post spawn as well that, the different things that the bass are doing at different times of the post spawn. All right, so we're going to jump into the webinar. Like I said, it will be recorded, and feel free to ask questions at any time. Definitely. I like that. It kind of breaks it up and, just kind of sees what you guys want to hear more about. Okay, get started. All right, and this is my contact information too. I'll give you at the end. Tyler Brinks, tbrinks@navionics.com. Feel free to send me questions afterwards. I'll also be sending you an email at the end of this webinar with that information. But just so you know, that's it. Okay, looks like we got a question already. Good question, Jason. Will this be more oriented towards smallmouth or largemouth? Really both. They're pretty similar how they act. Where I live, there's a little bit of both. So it's both. They'll apply to both. So you'll get something out of it either way. Good question. Okay. So I'm going to kind of talk about a few things today. The post-spawn funk. People always say they're in a bad mood, and it's really hard to fish in the post-spawn. And yeah, it is a little bit more challenging because they've been spawning. They're tired from the rigors of spawning. They've been basically not eating and just spawning. So now they're really hungry. But they're kind of disoriented. They're just kind of out of it. But there's ways to find the fish. There's techniques that work really well in this post-spawn period, and we'll talk about that. And we're going to also start off the immediate post-spawn, and that's when the fish are guarding fry, the fry guarders. I'll tell you a couple things that I do to catch fish, males guarding the fry. And then also the bluegill spawn, that's not too far after the bass spawn, and that's a great time of year to catch bass, especially shallow. That is a little bit more largemouth oriented in my experience, but the fry guarders, largemouth and smallmouth. Bait selection, and then locations. We'll go over all those and a few other things as well. Okay, so after the bass spawn, the male protects the fry until they're old enough to basically be let go, be on their own. It's kind of a short period of time where they are protecting the fry, the little tiny baby clouds of little tiny specks that are baby bass, and then eventually the bass turn on them and they become food for them. But the best thing to do that is to visibly locate the fry. And usually when you find the fry, the big balls of fry going all over the place, totally disoriented, the male bass will be pretty close by, either right below them or usually within sight, maybe right under a dock or right under a log. But these fish it's kind of similar to bed fishing because they're very protective over their fry during that period of time. So the two things that I do most is use a popper and also a fluke style bait, popping it right above the balls of the fry, or a fluke right in between them. And, that will usually catch a fry garter. So this is a kind of a spin on a fluke style bait that works really good when the bass are guarding fry. And this is an optimum bait. It's a victory bait. And I'm rigging it just as a victory shad, and I'm rigging it just like a wacky rig Senko. O-ring, regular weedless wacky hook, or just an octopus style hook. And then if you look closely right here, there's actually a nail weight inside of it. So that's going to allow it to dive down, and then you twitch it up, and it's perfect for when you find those balls of fry. It's something that a lot of people don't do, but it really imitates something trying to eat those fry. So that's a good way to catch bass that are guarding the fry. Like I said, the other thing is a popper, and there's a few different ones that I use, and it's kind of almost the same baits that I'm going to be talking about with the bluegill spawn, and I'll go over that as well. But big size popper, something with a feathered trailer, something that really gets their attention, works great when they're guarding the fry. Okay, so like I said, after the bass are done spawning, the bluegill aren't too far behind. This is actually happening right now where I live in Washington. Excuse me, I was out the other day, and there's bluegill beds everywhere. The bass were very close by. It's kind of a role reversal of sorts, because when the bass are spawning, the bluegill are trying to eat all the eggs, and then afterwards it's opposite. The bass are eating the bluegill when they spawn. So it's kind of funny how that works. And there's also a lot of times where there'll be wolf packs of bass, 5, 6 bass, just patrolling the shore looking for these bluegill beds. This is what was happening to me the other day. You can see this one I caught had a tail of a bluegill sticking out of it, little tiny bluegill. So they're definitely eating bluegill this time of year. And I kind of talked about the timing. It's typically, it's definitely after the bass spawn, usually a couple weeks after they spawn, and the bluegill will actually spawn for quite a ways into the summer. So, this post-spawn technique of fishing the bluegill spawn is really something that lasts quite a long time. And it's a great way to catch a lot of bass and a lot of big ones. So as far as, what baits I use, typically a swim jig is a good choice, something that looks like a bluegill, something with a big flapping trailer, a green pumpkin color works really well. Something like an Ultravive Speed Craw is a good trailer that I put on the back of it, or a Rage Menace Grub, something with a lot of flapping appendages on the back of that swim jig. Typically when I'm throwing a swim jig early in the year, I don't like as much action on the back of it, but this time of year you want to get as much action as you can. The other thing is the Zoom Brush Hog. That really, really works when they're eating bluegill. And I'll show you a little modification that I do to them to catch, to make them look more like a bluegill. And I use the baby brush hog, the full size, even the smaller one, the super hog. They all work really well. Okay. The other question, I got a couple questions, so I'll stop here and good. Keep them coming, guys. So would I say that would you say that popper is more of a reaction bite or feeding instinct? I would say both, because it does kind of imitate a insect or something struggling on the surface, dragonfly or something like that. So I think they are used to looking up at the surface to feed. So I think it is, and definitely reaction bite, especially if you can pitch under a dock or under a laydown. It's kind of crazy because it has treble hooks, but if you can just skip it somewhere that they're not expecting or not used to seeing a bait like that, you'll have a lot of success. So I think it's a little bit of both, Jason. Optimal water temp for the bass spawn. The thing that they always talk about is, kind of like the magic number is like a 62 degrees. And, that's typically for largemouth, and for smallmouth, it's, a little bit less because, smallmouth do spawn a little bit sooner. That's kind of like the temperature trigger, but you also have to factor, if it's surface temp, if it's morning temp, if it's evening temp, but once it's into the mid 60s, like all day, even in the morning, they're definitely going to be spawning for sure. So good question. Like kind of going back to what I'm experiencing now around where I live, it's in the 70s, and, they're way past spawning, it's mid 70s, and that's kind of when the bluegill are spawning. So, going back to the bluegill spawn, fishing that, like I was talking about that Zoom brush hog, there's also, the poppers and prop baits, something that makes a lot of commotion on the surface. And then swim baits are a good choice as well. And I'll show you a couple different ones that I'm using. So like I said, with the brush hogs, one thing I always do And really, this is about the only time I do it is, in the post spawn when they're feeding on the bluegill, and I dip the tails in chartreuse, and it just looks like the tail of a bluegill. It's kind of weird, but their tail is a little bit lighter. Sometimes you'll see a bluegill and you could see that little hint of lighter color. This chartreuse dye with a watermelon or green pumpkin really stands out, and it works really well. This is that super hog thing I was talking about. Works good, but really my favorites are the either the full size brush hog or the baby brush hog, just because it has a lot more action to it. But these are perfect to be pitching around anywhere you see bluegill beds, and you will catch bass. It's a great way to catch them. Here's two of my favorite top waters for the bluegill spawn, and really anytime the bass are shallow, but these are more bluegill pattern. This popper, I don't even know what kind it is. It says like all these numbers on it. It's just one I bought a long time ago, but I really like the look of it. And the popper, it's a little bit different. It has a kind of the cup facing down versus like straight out, so it kind of pops down a little bit. So it's a really cool popper when they're feeding on the bluegill. Same thing with a prop bait. This is a Lucky Craft Kelly J. There's also a really good one from Academy. I think it's like HTO brand. It's like $4 or $5, but it works really well. And they have some good patterns, and it really works good when they're fishing around when the bluegill are spawning. Okay. All right, so kind of the other thing that happens a lot during the post spawn that a lot of people hate is there's these cruising fish, and they're hard to catch no matter what time of year, but during the post spawn, I mean, they're really just kind of wandering aimlessly. Either they're looking for food or they're just tired, so they're kind of hard to predict on what they're going to bite. But the biggest thing is to be stealthy. If they see you, you're done. So you need to just kind of either know where they're going. If you see them, cast far past them, or if they're wandering in the same general area, you might have to come back and hope that they're still there, and you could make a cast to them before they see you. And I won't say that's always the case. I mean, sometimes if they see you, they'll swim away a little distance, and they kind of have a short memory. But typically, if they see you, they're going to just take off pretty fast. So my 3 top baits for cruising fish during this time of year is a drop shot. And one thing I do with the drop shot when I'm casting shallow is I use a lighter weight than normal. If I'm fishing deeper, I'm going to be using like a 3/16 or a quarter, even all the way up to like a 3/8. But I really like an 1/8 ounce when I'm fishing shallow, under 5 feet in the post spawn period when the bass are just kind of cruising around. Also a Senko, and I'll kind of cover that a little bit later with, the 3 different ways that I rig it. They all work really well. And then a weightless worm, and it doesn't have to be a stick bait. It could be any weightless worm. One of my favorite things to use during this time of year is a robo worm with just a little hook on it. And the robo worm will actually float, but having that little hook, like a size 1 Texas rig, little tiny hook, that will give it enough weight to have it fall very slowly. And that's very good for cruising fish if you can time it right and have it fall right in front of their face when they're swimming by. That's a great way to catch cruising fish. Okay. All right. Another thing I love about this time of year is top water is awesome during the post spawn. It is something you could do all day. I mean, if you look at this picture, you can see it's pretty sunny out. It wouldn't be what you'd call like a prime top water time. There's a little ripple, but this particular case, the fish were right on the edge of this dock. And I kind of mentioned this earlier, but after they spawn, they really group up together. So you can catch a fish and have 3 or 4 following it, and it's not that uncommon. So they get really aggressive when there's another one going for that bait. So you can really throw topwater just about any time, during this time period. A lot of people only throw it first thing in the morning, or if they're going out after work, right before it gets dark. But you can throw a topwater all the time, especially during the post spawn. This is a Lucky Craft Sammy. It works really well. There's a lot of them that I use, and I'll kind of show you some of the different ones that I use as well. So like I just said, it can be an all-day bite. They do school, and those wolf packs that I was talking about earlier, that's pretty common in the post spawn period. It's like they spawn, they swim around and look for friends to swim with, and they kind of hunt together. And that really does keep them feeding all day. So, some of the places that I look for, fishing the deep side of docks, all the way at the ends, even going parallel out in front of the docks and casting along a section of docks is a great way to do it, because they may be wandering in between those two docks. Submerged grass is another good place to find, post-spawn topwater fish. And really what I like to do is I like to fish pretty fast until I find them, and then maybe slow down, either throw the topwater all the way around the object, maybe switch to something more finesse as well. That's a great way to do it. You just cover water first until you find them, and then get into, slowing down and doing things like that. Okay, well, kind of go over briefly my topwater setups. I use a lot of different topwater baits. I'm not partial to any one brand. There's even a lot more than this. I really like the Lucky Craft Sammy. I've been using that forever. The Ima Skimmer is a really good one, has a good action. A Super Spook, the big giant one. The Mega Bass Dog X. There's a lot of good topwater baits out there. The Yozuri 3DB pencil. Those are all good baits. And anything that's good quality bait nowadays, it's going to walk really easily, and they're all going to catch fish. So just find one that you like. You like the color, like the price, everything else, and it's going to work great for you. With the rod and reel, typically I like a 7-foot or less. Usually I've gotten into a point where I'm using a lot of longer rods for a lot of techniques, but the way I work a topwater, I like a 7-foot or less. Sometimes even a 6'6". Just so I can work downwards and quickly instead of having to work more side to side. It's just a preference. So it's just kind of what fits you. And I do like a faster gear ratio reel, like a 7-to-1, just so I can reel it in really quickly. If I'm close to the boat, or if I see one busting somewhere, I can reel it in real quick and make another cast. And again, that kind of comes down to preference as well. When it comes to line, it's either straight braid for me. I like the Seaguar Smackdown. 50 pound, it seems like a lot, but it's very thin, so you can still cast it a long ways. I found that 40 is pretty good too, and 30 is too thin for bait casting gear, in my opinion. Or if I'm going to use mono, 15 or 20 pound, they have a mono called Senshi. It's really, really good. I use that as well. There is one instance where I'll use a mono leader with that braid, and that's when I'm using those prop baits. Because if you use straight braid, it's going to wrap around the prop, and it's just going to be a headache because the braid's so limp. Eventually, it's going to wrap around that prop, and it's just going to be a nightmare. So if you do that, either go with mono or a braid with a mono leader. Okay. All right, guys. You guys have been good about sending questions, but if you have any more, just feel free to send them off. We will get them answered. Excuse me. All right, so like I said earlier, this time of year, they are kind of in a weird mood, so sometimes you do have to finesse them. The 3 finesse rigs that I use the most this time of year is a drop shot, of course, a shaky head, a Ned Rig. That's something that I've been using for about a year or so. It's gaining a lot of popularity, and I'll kind of give you a quick story on that. I mean, I fished it for last year, and I caught tons of little tiny fish, like 6, 7, 8 to 12-inch fish, and this year I've finally been catching a lot of big fish on it, 3-4 pounders. So it's really given me a lot of confidence in that little technique. And if you're not familiar with it, I'll give you an overview of it, but it's a great rig, and it gets bites in just about any situation. All these are excellent choices, and they're good for those less aggressive fish. So when it comes to drop shot, kind of like the topwater baits, I'm not too picky. I mean, I am picky, but there's a lot of baits that I use, so I'm not like restricted to just a few things. Like a Roboworm, a Berkeley Havoc, a Moneymaker. This is a Kitech Sexy Impact, Easy Shiner, Berkeley Twitchtail Minnow. I've been using a lot of the Rains Bubbling Shaker lately. So there's a lot of different baits out there, and I will experiment throughout the day. I'll have this is kind of what the deck of my boat will look like. I'll have just a pile of these different baits, and I'll just grab one and switch it out, just if I'm not getting bit and I want to try something different. So that's one thing I do quite a bit. Okay, looks like we got a question coming through. Oh, good question. And unfortunately, I don't have too much experience with this. I have some. But the question is, I've been hearing a lot about the gliding jigs for finesse and the post spawn, at least here in Florida. And what are your thoughts on these? And like I kind of alluded to, I haven't used them. It's a cool idea, and if you guys aren't familiar with it, it's kind of like it's like a spinnerbait blade, and it has a hook coming out of the top of it, so it looks kind of like an old Johnson's minnow kind of thing, and then it has a keeper for your bait, and you Texas rig it, and it falls like crazy. Unfortunately, I haven't used it, but I think that that technique, it is finesse, and I think that it's definitely something different. So I think it might work great this time of year. Honestly, I just wish I had more experience. That I have a pack of them, and I just haven't used them yet, Justin. That kind of reminds me. I'll use them. Good question. All right, so my drop shot setups, and if you guys have checked out my other webinars, I drop shot quite a bit. I did one last year, I did one this year on advanced drop shot fishing. I drop shot quite a bit. I have several different rods that I use. The two that I'm using the most are both very similar in action. It's a 7-foot medium light Ultra MBX from Phoenix, and the Abu Garcia Villain 2.0, same length in action. I do like a little bit softer tip, because I moved that drop shot quite a bit, and I just like a little bit more of a whippy rod with still a good backbone as well. The two reels I'm using this year, the Rebo MGX spinning reel in a 20, and the Shimano Sustain. Those are both excellent reels. And really the more important thing about what I'm saying about those two is the size. Some people use a really giant reel for it. I think it kind of it doesn't balance as well with a light rod like that. And then some people are on the other end of it, and they use a really tiny reel, like a size 10 or a size 1000, because it's more of a finesse. But I think it doesn't hold enough as much line. It's a little bit too light. So I think that 20 size, even the 30 in the Abu Garcias, and even in the 2500 or 3000 if you're used to a Shimano and how they name theirs. So that's just kind of my preference. Line, I use braid 100% of the time when I'm using a spinning reel. It's just the way to go. Braid with a fluorocarbon leader. I'll never go back. And like I said, if you've checked out my other webinars, I love doing that. 15 or 20 pound cigar smackdown braid. Again, it's very thin, so you can get away with using relatively high pound test braid on a spinning reel. I tried 10, and it was actually too thin for me. I used to use 10 of some other brands, and that may work for you if you're not using the Cigar stuff, but just definitely something that has like a 6 or 8 pound diameter is the way I would go. And then the leader, I use that Cigar Tatsu 6 or 8 pound, and Vizex is a good one too, a Brazex, and then modified Albright to join the two. And if you're not familiar with that knot, it's really what all the pros that I've ever talked to, that's all they swear by, that knot. So definitely go to YouTube. If you've never tied that knot, learn how to do it. It's pretty easy. I used to do uni to uni, and I think that this is actually easier and faster to tie. Talked about baits. Again, I use all kinds. Even some of these weren't even in the picture that I've talked about. Okay, I got some more questions. Okay, good question. Do you use the high vis braid? Yeah, I love that stuff. The yellow braid. It's very good, and I do like it, especially for drop shot fishing, so you can see those light bites. It also works very well on a wacky rig, because a lot of times they hit on the fall, so that high vis is great. And you still have that fluorocarbon leader, so I don't think you scare any fish. I know some people ask me about that, but I don't have any problem with that. Okay, another good question. Have you used the Zoom Frog with Texas rig and a 32nd ounce weight, and just drag it across the grass and let it fall slow? I have thrown a horny toad quite a bit, especially when I was living in Florida. That was an awesome way to catch them, really all times of year, but post spawn too, especially when they are in the grass, kind of recovering from the spawn, in places like that, where there's a lot of grass. That's another good option to look for post spawn fish, is deep in the grass and punching and things like that. I'm not going to go too much into that, but I think that that horny toad is a good option. Okay, that's pop this up here. Okay, sorry about that, guys. Okay, so these are two of the shaky head rigs that I use quite a bit. You know, this is a Reaction Innovations Flirt, and this is Zoom Trickworm. And if you'll notice, I use different, it's kind of hard to see from here, but you actually use different styles of shaky heads depending on the bait. You know, these are the ones with the spring on them, and for some baits, they work really well. I just prefer that it doesn't have the really tiny spring. If it's a good size spring, it will hold the bait a lot easier, and it'll be a lot easier to rig. You know, this is the style that has the collar on it. For a bait like the Zoom Trickworm, it kind of has a tapered end, so I actually just pinch off a little bit, so it's more of a straight, and it just fits a lot better if you take off a little bit of it. So I do use both sizes, or styles, I should say. Okay, kind of quick question real quick. Paul said he missed the one on drop shotting and he'd like to watch it. And you know, all these are going to be on the Navionics YouTube page. I believe I put that one on my personal YouTube page. You can just type in Tyler Brinks Fishing on YouTube. I believe that one's on there for sure, because I just did that one a couple months ago. Okay, and with the shaky head setup, it's very similar to what I was using for drop shotting. I just use a medium instead of a medium light, and I actually like a slightly longer rod. This is 7'2" Phoenix M1 that I use. Same line. You know, some of the baits. You know, I talked about the Trickworm, Reaction Innovations Flirt, even a 4-inch Senko or the Pro Senko, the thinner ones, and then the Rains Bubbling Shaker. Those are the baits that I use with shaky head. Okay, now the Ned Rig. Like I said, I was going to talk more about that. This is just from a few weeks ago. This was a nice one I caught on the Neko Rig, and this is it if you guys aren't familiar with it. It's just looks like a half of Senko. It's from Z-Man, and then you can see it has a bright yellow jig head, and you know, they make them in black and red, but I really like that bright one. It seems to attract the fish. And you know, I kind of talked about the wolf pack mentality of fish this time of year. This was a funny thing because I caught this largemouth and there's 2 smallmouth following it. So you know, I had that question at the beginning, if it's gonna be smallmouth or largemouth oriented. You know, I think they kind of hang out in the same places. You know, just from things like this that I've seen, where they'll actually, you know, be just a little bit offshore, just right off the edge of the grass line. You know, that's where this fish was. Okay, with the rig, you know, it's going to be the same rod, reel, and line as drop shot. You know, nothing fancy. The trick about this is it's a very small weight. It's a 1/10 of an ounce. They even have smaller ones. I believe it's a 15th or a 20th. But the key is that slow fall. You know, like I said, I like that bright colored jig head, and just fish it very slow and just drag it on the bottom, basically. And it works under all conditions. You know, we had a tournament in March, and there was over half the field blanked, including myself. And some guys were actually using a Ned Rig and catching fish, you know, under those tough conditions. You know, and I was in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario earlier, I guess early last month, and fishing was pretty tough because it was still so cold. The Ned Rig was the #1 bait, and we were catching big smallmouth. You know, not so much on Erie, I should say, but on the Niagara River where you can actually fish it. You know, it was a great technique. You know, I got a couple more questions here. Okay. Okay, this kind of a rigging tip. How do you hook a lizard? Get it to swim flat. Keep the twist out of the line. You know, just a standard Texas rig is what I always use. You know, just make sure when you connect the bottom of it that you kind of bend the worm inwards a little bit so you can hook it through, and then it's a straight. Because if you just hook it straight in, it is going to be kind of twisted. So you know, just a standard Texas rig is the way I'm going to use it all the time, because it is going to swim a lot flatter and you're not going to get as much twist. So good question. And the lizard's a great option too during the spawn and the post spawn as well. It's just something that a lot of people, including myself, just haven't used as much lately. But you know, bass smash those things. You know, it's also hard to beat a Senko. Like I said, I rig it a lot of different ways. Texas rig, wacky rig, Neko rig, any natural color for clear water. You know, any of the green pumpkins. You know, also the watermelons are a good choice. You know, one of my favorite is actually that cinnamon brown with no flake. It looks kind of like a flesh color, but it works really well in the clear water. and then black or black and blue for dirty water. So pretty simple. So where I'm going to use the Texas rig, and again, this is post spawn. It's a great technique for post spawn because it has such a subtle action that a lot of times that's what they're looking for. So around grass and cover, I'll use a weighted for pitching the cover. I'll just put a regular bullet weight and actually pitch the cover. But most of the time it's weightless, because the great thing about that Senko is how it falls and how it shakes as it falls down. That's the whole trick. That's why, in my opinion, the actual Gary Yamamoto one is the best ever, and it just has the perfect fall. There's some other more inexpensive ones, but I never use them because I just do not get the same action out of them. Typically, I'm going to use a 4/0 extra wide gap, Gamakatsu or Owner, any good quality hook with a 5-inch size bait. Wacky rig, and this is excellent again for the post spawn period. It's really one of my go-tos when they're done spawning. That slow fall is awesome. So around sparse grass and cover, I'll also weight it a little bit with it's something called the Eco Pro Tungsten Pro Wacky weight. And if you guys haven't seen it, look it up. I'm sorry I didn't get a picture of it, but it's a small weight that you stick into your bait, and then you hook through the weight. It's really cool. Just so check it out. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't get a picture of that, but it does help you fish a wacky rig a little bit deeper. But most of the time I'm using weightless, size 1 octopus or 1/0 or the weedless wacky hook. That's typically going to be good enough for you. Oh, so the Neko Rig, and if you guys aren't familiar with this, I'm going to show you a little bit about this. Let's make sure I got a picture coming up of this. I do. Okay, so this is excellent for deep docks and cover. It gives it a different action because it will fall straight down if you rig it right. You could fish it down to 20 or 30 feet. I was doing that a lot last year. I was finding a lot of these really deep docks that are 20 or 30 feet deep, just those floating docks, and the fish were suspending just 10, 15 feet down under those docks. But you could fish it down as deep as you wanted to. But during that time, I actually did a video on my YouTube page, and I think it's just called Neko Rig Fishing or something like that. But it was crazy. I actually got hung up on a dock, went up there to unhang my bait from one of the ropes, and I looked down and there was bass everywhere, just kind of hanging out after the spawn. And the Neko Rig was crushing them that day. So many different baits will work that way. Yamamoto Senko, also the Reaction Innovations Pocket Rocket, straight tail worm, trick worm, any of those baits will work for this technique. So this is some of the gear that you need for the Neko Rig. And if you guys aren't familiar with it, it's an awesome way to catch those deeper bass. So I got my wacky hook here. This is one of them that I use. This is an O-ring, which you can see here. You can just buy those at the hardware store, or they have ones made for fishing that you can buy at different places. And then this is a nail weight that you'll insert into here, into the bottom side over here. And then, like I said, it's going to fall straight down. This is actually a weight made for Neko rigging from Demiki, and it actually fits right into the end of a Senko or another style bait. But it's a great way to catch those fish. It's a very popular technique, and it works very good. So like I said, I either use a tungsten nail weight, the Demiki Neko Rig weight. You could use an actual nail, but the problem that I found is finding ones that are heavy enough, because they're made out of so many different materials. There's like nickel and steel and all this stuff. So you got to find one that is relatively heavy for the size. And you also want to find one that's easy to break, because if it's a giant nail, it's going to mess up the action of your bait. So if you could find one that's thick enough, that's heavy enough, and that you could cut in half, that'd be the way to go. If not, buy one of those tungsten nail weights, or you could even get they actually make lead ones as well. I think it's Lunker City that makes one that you can actually break really easily. That's a great option. One thing I do with all these, and this is one way to kind of preserve those weights a little bit, is to heat them with a lighter and then stick them into the plastic. So you actually use your pliers. Make sure you do that or you're going to burn your hand. But hey, hold on to that weight, burn it with a lighter, and then stick it into the bait, and that's going to just seal to that plastic, and it's going to hold a lot better. Because if you don't, every once in a while you're going to make a cast, and that tungsten nail weight that costs quite a bit or a Demiki Neko Rig weight or something like that is just going to fly out. So definitely use that lighter to help preserve it. Kind of along those same lines, using an O-ring I think is a must, because otherwise you're going to hook it in the center of the bait and it's just going to shred your bait, and you're going to lose your bait, you're going to lose your weight, you're going to lose all that stuff. So just a little simple O-ring, slide it over your bait, and then you just barely skin hook, the plastic, and you're mostly hooking that O-ring. So I think that's a must. Find one that fits pretty snugly onto it. That's another key as well. And when I'm fishing this during the post spawn, and really honestly all the time with the Neko Rig, is fishing it on a slack line to detect bites, and just to keep it falling straight down, because that's really my best luck has been fishing it vertically, being basically right on top of the cover, that deep cover, casting it out and letting it fall straight down. So especially this time of year, during the post spawn, the Neko Rig is really hard to beat. Another thing too that kind of along the same lines with topwater, like we were talking about earlier, is the fish are grouped up, they're hungry, and they will crush a crankbait. This was Tuesday. You can see this fish is a pretty good sized fish, maybe 4 pounds or so, but you can see it's pretty flat belly. This is definitely a post spawn fish. It had a kind of messed up tail from spawning as well, but it ate a crankbait. So, and then I actually went back to this area later to try to catch another one, and I saw 2 fish suspended under a buoy, like a rope with a big marker buoy thing. There's 2 fish suspending right where I caught that fish earlier in the day. So they were just kind of hanging out in that area. Okay, good question. And this is going back to the Neko Rig. How do I decide between the tungsten weight or the Demiki head? Let's go back there real quick, because that's a good question. Okay, so if you look at the Neko Rig weight, it has this, it's kind of like a half circle or a mushroom head or something like that. So it just kind of depends on what bait I'm using, honestly, because this will not work very well at all in like a trick worm or something like that. So it fits very snugly up to the end of one of these, just because of the size of or the shape of the bait. It fits perfectly into a Senko or their bait. It's the Demiki Stinger. So that's one way that I decide is the bait I'm using, but also depending on the size as well, because this is a pretty big piece of lead. I mean, they have smaller ones, obviously, but these tungsten nail weights, you can get very, very small ones. And if you're using a different bait, like a Zoom swamp crawler or a roboworm, even, you're not going to want a big, giant Neko Rig weight sitting in it. So that's kind of how I use them. Both of them are good choices, though. And also just whatever I have available too. Okay, so we're talking about cranking a little bit. So like I said, it's one of the best times of year for cranking, because they are going to be schooling, they're going to be looking to eat. So what I like to do, kind of like topwater fishing, fish fast, from shallow to deep till you find them, but cover a lot of water, because once you find them, they're typically going to be grouped up, just like the wolf packs that I was talking about with either the bluegill spawn or the topwater. They're definitely going to be schooled up. Another can't fail thing is to find the bait. If you find a lot of shad in an area, if you have shad where you live, or a lot of perch or something like that, there's definitely opportunity to catch a lot of bass quickly. Okay, good question. Can you decide the transition from post-spawn funk to the ensuing feeding frenzy afterwards? And it's kind of, how can I say this? It can be very short. I mean, it might be a couple days where they're in that post-spawn funk where they're really not wanting to bite anything, and then they immediately start feeding. I think it more comes down to the food in the area, the opportunities. If they're right after they spawn and there's bait fish everywhere, they're going to start feeding a lot sooner. But if they're kind of still out of it looking for food, just like I was talking about earlier, wandering around, it might take a little bit longer. So that transition can be very short, to answer your question. Okay, like I did with the other stuff, I'll go over some of my cranking setups. Again, I use a lot of different cranking rods. I think I have 4 or 5, and I love them all, and I use them for different things. You know, I like a Phoenix glass cranking rod. You know, I'm also using a 7-foot medium Abu Garcia villain rod. And that's actually not a specific cranking rod, but it works very well for shallow diving crankbaits and square bills and stuff. And then for those deep cranks, you know, lately I've been using the Ike rod. It's a like 710 medium heavy. It's a giant rod, but it works really well for those big big baits like the I'm a Beast Hunter down here, the Strike King 6XD, Megabass Deep 6. Typically, when it comes to reels, though, I'm going to be pretty basic. You know, just a 6.3 to 1. You know, a lot of people like those really slow retrieves, and I really don't. You know, I just kind of slow down with my actual reeling. You know, I don't like the super fast ones, on the other hand, because, you know, just regular reeling is still pretty fast. So I found that 6.3 is a good option. You know, those otherwise you're using the slow gear ratio. Again, this is just preference, but you're going to be cranking forever, and it feels like you're not doing anything, like you're just not moving. You know, you kind of have to for those really big crankbaits like the 10XD and things like that, but I never use those. I, you know where I use them up here, so that's not I really don't have an option for a need for a 5.1. Again, just preference. 12-pound fluorocarbon is how I always crank, either the Tatsu or the Brazex if I'm around a lot of rocks and stuff. I mean, both these lines are very good for abrasion resistance, though. Some of my baits, I'm a pin jack. That's what that picture was that I showed you a couple minutes ago. Rapala DT6, Strike King 3XD. Those are all great baits, and they're smaller profiles. They work great in the post spawn, but if you got to get out a little bit deeper, even like that 10 to 15 foot range, and I know these baits dive a lot deeper, but I like to grind them into the ground. So like the Beast Hunter runs around 14 feet. The 6XD, I mean, you can get it down to 20. Same with the Deep 6. But if you're in that 14-foot range, you're going to be grinding into the bottom, and that's a great way to catch schooling fish during the post spawn. That's what I was using the other day. Yeah, like I said, this is just a Revo 12-pound line. It's that I'm a Beast Hunter, and this is that purple Ike rod. You know, this is in the Delay series, because it was a Power series that's, you know, more like jigs and stuff like that, but the Delay has a little bit better cranking action. I've been pretty happy with it, and they're reasonably priced too. I think they're pretty good rods. They're like $149, something like that. Oh, I'm just reading a question here. Hey Larry, I'm not quite sure I understand still. So if you can send me an email afterwards, you know, going back to the lizard rig, and I'll read it again when I have more time. But I'll send you an email if I could think of it, or you send me an email. Yeah, so good question here too. Do you feel that the post spawn areas are similar in nature to the summer pattern locations? It's very similar. You know, they're going to get there towards a later post spawn, but immediately after the post spawn, or after the spawn, I should say, it's more like a spawning. So if you can kind of follow where they go to the summer and where they spawn, they're going to be somewhere in between. And I'll kind of show you that on a map here in a second. Yeah, like I was saying, this is my cranking setup for the deep cranks, the big cranks. You can see it's a little chewed up from just catching fish. You know, one other option, and we'll kind of speed up a little bit because we're moving along. Okay. So another great way to catch post spawn fish is a jig and a creature bait, you know, flipping and pitching just outside of the spawning areas. You know, think of where the fish are spawning, where you always see them spawn every year, where you caught them when they were spawning earlier this year, and then kind of look around you, and it's going to be pretty close to within sight of where you are. You know, it's either going to be the next isolated cover, you know, that big log that's just outside of the spawning area, that one dock that's all by itself, or, you know, the deepest ends of the lily pads or something like that, you know, but relatively close to where you were catching them when they were spawning. That's where they're going to be going. You know, kind of going back to that question I just answered about summer, it's going to be there, and then once you get to this area, you look a little bit deeper, you know, right behind you, and that's where they're going to be during the summer typically. And we'll say that's always the case, because I think there's fish that live shallow year round, and I think that there's fish that spawn deep, stay deep. You know, they just are kind of a deeper mentality. That's kind of one of my theories I've always talked about, that, you know, bass are like people. You know, some like to live out in the middle of nowhere in the country for, you know, people, and some like to live in the city. It's kind of the same. That's my theory on how I look at things. You know, that some bass will always be shallow, some will always be deep. But that's a whole nother topic. So with this isolated cover, it's good for big fish, but you might only catch one or two. You know, it's definitely a good way to do it. And this actually just happened to me, I don't know, a week or so ago. So this is one I caught fishing these pad lines, and this actual pad line goes all the way around here for the whole lake. I mean, or not the whole lake, but quite a ways. And I pulled up, started pitching, and caught this one, you know, 5-pounder or so, pitching a jig just to these outside pads. They spawn back in here, and then, you know, they kind of move out here after they spawn, or they, going back to my theory, they could be, you know, just a little bit deeper in the grass. But I pitched forever after this and didn't catch any more. So like I said, it's isolated fish, but it's a great way to catch a big post spawn fish. And you can see this is definitely a post spawn fish. You can, if you look closely, you can see my just flat belly. Basically, it's like empty. You can see my fingers just pressing into it. I wasn't even holding it that hard. So this is the area that I was actually at. This is a lake right by me. So all this is pads around here. You can see this shallow blue on the Navionics. This came from the web app. And if you guys want to check out maps for free, go to navionics.com, click on web app, and then you could scroll in to look at a lake that you want to fish. It's kind of like a try it before you buy it if you don't own a card or don't own the map, but it's free, and I use it all the time. So this is all the areas that the pads are. So, you know, they spawn back here because it's really shallow, and it's just a nice flat. You can see the contour. This whole area is very similar in depth. It's all the same. And then, you know, this is an island out here that they move out to as well. So the spawn, post spawn, and then summer, you know, that's kind of how it works a lot of times. You know, they kind of move out in the lake. And, you know, this is just one example. You know, it's different on every lake, but I just know this from looking at the map and from actually catching fish in all phases on this body of water. Okay, flipping and pitching setup. You know, I like a longer rod typically. You know, the one I've been using lately is a 7.6 Phoenix Recon 2. It's called a 766, so it's a heavy action rod. You know, I also use a Powell quite a bit. I think it's a 775, so it's a 7.7. And I do like a faster retrieve for this technique as well. So when you make a pitch, usually they're gonna hit it right as it is falling, so then you can reel it in real quick and make another one. Line, I've been really happy with the Seagar flipping fluorocarbon, 20-pound. They actually make 25 and 30. 20 is good enough for me for most of what I'm doing. Or 17-pound Abrazex. Baits, you know, the Eco Pro Tungsten heavyweight jig, either the 3/8 or ½ ounce. That's one the picture I showed you was a 3/8 in the black color. Sweet Beaver, Brush Hog, or a flipping tube. Those are great options. Okay. All right, guys. Well, if you have any more questions, feel free to send them off. I'm going to go ahead and go to this last slide real quick. I do have one more webinar coming up, and it is my last one, my 6th one of the year. So thanks to everyone for being at all of them. You know, if not, like I said, you can catch them on YouTube, on the Navionics YouTube. I'll get this one up as soon as I can on my YouTube page, Tyler Brinks Fishing. And then also we'll have one on, it'll also be on the Navionics website. There'll be a link to it as well. So my last one is next month, and it's summer bass fishing in the Pacific Northwest. You know, that's where I live, but don't worry if you don't live here. It's very similar to a lot of different areas that I've been to. You know, I've been to Western New York. I've been to Michigan. Places like that have very similar types of fishing. You know, all the Midwest, most of the West. I mean, there's some very much similarities between the two, so you might still get something out of it. Okay. All right, so next thing I'll show you real quick, and I'll get to some questions. Okay, so these are ways to send me follow-up questions. Just all these options right here. I will respond to them all. But I'll go ahead and get to some of the questions that are going through. We've got a couple more minutes. So have you ever used an A rig in the post spawn? And is it a viable or effective option? I would say, yeah, it's a viable option. I'm really not a big fan of it, just because it's where I live now. It's 3 hooks. It's very cumbersome to throw. I don't use it very much, but I know people do catch them in the post spawn. It really excels in the cold weather, but I think it will work fine this time of year. Good question too. On the Navionics app, if you're going to a brand new lake, which I do quite a bit, I actually have a tournament coming up to a lake I've never fished. I have that in about a week, 2 weeks away, so I got to start thinking about that. But if you're going to go to a brand new lake and the bass are in a post spawn phase, what are the first things you're going to look for on a Navionics map? First thing I'm going to look for is flats, places where they would have spawned before, and then I'm going to move backwards to where I think they're going to be after they spawn as they move out. So really just looking for spawning areas, shallow flats, places like that, backwater canals, things like that, where I know they're going to be spawning or have spawned, and then kind of work backwards outside of that to the mouth of the canals, or the edges of the flats, the deep sides of it, that isolated cover. Those are kind of things that I'd be looking for on the map. Good question. Are you going to show any locations for post spawn in reservoirs? And it's kind of similar to kind of what I was talking about. Just kind of look at where the fish spawn. If it's somewhere that you're familiar with, places that you always catch them when they're spawning, or places like I was talking about, if it's a new lake that you think they would spawn, and then just kind of move backwards from that. Usually pretty close to that is where I'd be looking for the post spawn fish in reservoirs. Really kind of the same thing in all situations. Okay, got a couple more minutes. Okay, good. Yeah, kind of good follow up here. So would it be secondary points? Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great option, especially if there are coves and fingers and things like that. And they're not on the main lake points, which they typically are. Winter, summer, places like that. So I think a secondary point would be a great option for post spawn fish, especially if there's a shallow backwater behind those secondary points. Yeah, I definitely think that'd be a good option. All right. Good questions, guys. I appreciate it. Makes it a lot easier when I got people asking questions. All right. Well, if that's that, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you so much for attending. Again, like I said, it will be recorded. We'll also have another one coming up, so definitely register for that one. I really appreciate it. And then go ahead and if you have any questions, feel free to send them off. All right. Thanks, guys.